Right, we're going to get started. Welcome to today's webinar on cultivation and test workflows. If you do have any questions, there is a Q&A box. I believe it should be on the right-hand side of your screen. You'll be able to drop us any questions you have there, and we'll be able to get back to you. I do encourage you all to stay through the end of the webinar because we do have a new feature that we're showcasing today.
So we'll look at the basic dependencies in the cultivation and then just look at how plants move through and then field any questions. And so, before and from the plant listing, of course, we can create plants. We can also, if we don't want to load the plant listing every time, we can also create plants right from the main menu. And then the create plant screen gives us the indicators of the dependencies. So for instance, a strain has to be built, locations have to be built, and that's pretty much it. We can build feeding schedules, and we'll look at that briefly. Plant types are hard-coded, as are the phases. And so dependency-wise, we go into our settings, and then we have cultivation locations, different from storage locations. Storage locations hold, inventory. Cultivation locations hold plants. And we set up any number of cultivation locations. There's reporting on what plants are in what location. And the locations also allow us to put filters or restrictions on the feeding schedules. So for instance, you can put a feeding schedule in, or actually that's phase. So like a phase could have a feeding schedule. Strains, there's a couple steps to create strains. Like we see a couple strain things on here, the facility strains and strain listings. First of all, we go to advanced settings and look at our organizational strains. And so like if you have multiple grows or growing in EI or whatever, the strains that you add here will add to the whole org. And we can enable any strains at any point and create new. And so creating new, little funky on this layout, but it's like if we were going to add new strain, we can see that it doesn't find new strain, but we do have the ability to highlight this create option new strain. And if we click on that, it can take a second. But then this will actually add to the system right through this modal. And then we want to make sure to click in the modal to remove the drop down so that we can hit the save button, right? So because like right here now the new strain is selected. If we click outside of the modal, it'll close the modal, but like just clicking inside of it, we can create new. When that strain gets put in the system, then it is automatically included in the organization. But this can be the tricky part where we put it in the organization, then we go to create plants and we can't create plants under that strain because we need to add it to the facility first. And so same kind of thing can happen here. New. Clearly it's been done once or twice. So we can add new strain here. It would take a Sev3 effort to marry these up. So if you do see this, it's best to like not do two different strains because even though it's an exact name match, it'll look as two different strains. So you won't be able to harvest plants together if they're made up of the same name but different entry of strain. And then the strain listing. This gives the ability to define a couple things about the strain. The main one that's helpful is the strain code. So like NS, everything has a strain code. And then the strain code is what will be automatically taxonomized into batch names and harvest names of plants. And so if there's no strain name, that will just not happen. And so when we create plants, well, we can look at feeding schedules super quick. So feeding schedules are built by ingredients. And ingredients can go in any category. Think of an ingredient as a very mini product master, item master. We have had a few requests and some comments in the chat would be great. We haven't seen it in a while, but the request to batch track ingredients, has been there. Right now, we're just putting an ingredient name, an ingredient category, You can make new categories by just typing them in here and adding them. And then suppliers, this comes from our list of partners, and then UOM and cost. And right now, a little bit of a chunky workaround for ingredients, especially if you get ingredients at different costs or different batches, is just make each ingredient itself a batch. And especially if you're just applying ingredients themselves to plants versus applying feeding schedules, then there's not too many extra steps. But, you know, using the ingredient as a batch might be like throw a, and then a date, for instance. And maybe then this is the batch of it. Then you just have a bunch of grow A's in here. But if people are kind of using this and looking for batch tracking, that'd be great to see some comments about. And then with the feeding schedules are kind of like assemblies in the EI. As far as we can look at an existing one, we can see prop, veg, flower. These are just the names of the feeding schedules, of course, but like then the feeding schedule can have, like rooms associated. And that way you can name it. You can have a phase associated. So maybe it's an ingredient that might be, or it's a feeding schedule that could be allowed at any phase in any room, but you can isolate these. And then you've got liters and then costs. And what tends to work a little bit better for people is kind of, you know, adding ingredients to groups of plants or not automating the feeding schedules. Because the problem is here we have not costed this beyond 2 decimal places. You know, so if you get stuff in bulk, then you're, you know, and you're tracking every single feeding, which means you're tracking like to the milligrams of stuff. You might actually end up with stuff that is like 0 cents per milligram, you know, 0.000003 cents or something. So loading on like lots of like the day's worth of ingredients in a room, or maybe the week's worth of ingredients in a room, that at least get the costs on there that can be averaged out in QuickBooks. But I'd be curious on people's workflows there and desires there also. And then we create plants. And so we have our plant listing page, phases up here, propagation, veg, flower, inactive. So plants never go out of the system. Harvested and deleted plants go inactive, and in some cases can be brought back on the front end. In some cases, you might need step 3. And so when we create plants, basically we're selecting strain name, we're selecting planting date, plant type. The sources if we want to bring them from inventory, but that's not a requirement necessarily. And this is the number of plants. We can tag a plant as a mother anytime. And then if we do, we can select the mother if there are existing plants in the system from that strain. And then we have location, our cultivation location. We can see the list of things that we had from the cultivation locations. And then our feeding schedules. And in this case, we only have the prop feeding schedule because each of those feeding schedules is just those sample feeding schedules on the other side that we saw. They're just each dedicated to one room and one phase. Of course, you can have multiples for any of those. Now, when we look at the plant listing, you know, multi-selecting. So in here, you could do some cutting and pasting. I'll do that since I don't have label. Well, I have a label from, but no scanner. So the 2 different ways to kind of look through this in search, you know, are going into scan search mode, which now you see this like drop down come here, or not in scan search. And like if I go to not scan search, I can search this batch, and if it's like pages of it, then you don't have to return pages, it'll be paginated. If it goes beyond, you know, the maximum allowable entries. And if we go on to scan search, the main difference with scan search is things will return already selected. So now, of course, I have the batch ID on my clipboard. So I might be saying I'm scanning a batch and then scan it. Then this will return with each page all auto-selected. so that I don't have to move through different pages and select and maybe not select one and miss plants here. And that can be done with plants too, and they come back selected if you're in scan search mode. And the other edit piece here, we go to plant modification. We can package plants, which will put them in inventory that then they can go on a purchase order to get sent out, or a sales order, sorry, to get sent out. We can destroy plants from here. Plant modification has individual plant modifications. It's not terribly obvious. It's just like a completion button, but like we can go down here, and then this gives the ability to edit a few more details about the individual plants, and as well as turning individual plants into mothers instead of like the whole batch. So we can one-off edit plants, but we can also mass edit plants if like we're moving them to flower or veg. And then that gets us to harvest, which of course starts at the flowering phase. We have one blue crack in here, and now we can harvest the plant. That will bring us to the harvest page, which we can go to at any point. In the demo site, we don't clear stuff out of here very often, so there's really old stuff up here, 2021. The idea being, though, that you wouldn't have old batches in here perpetually, and the oldest batches would be the ones that would be worked on first because they're like the closest to being done, so that's why it goes oldest first here. But these are active headers, so you can always sort it, and get to the newest stuff. You can split a batch as long as you haven't created a package for that batch. And creating the first package is, of course, the small package that goes to the lab. So we can see, like if I do that, that has a test result, even though it's failed, which means it's had a package that's gone to the lab, whereas this one has not, and I can split it. And this allows me to split the weight of the package, or of the batch, into two different batches. And then what we see on the very first time we create a package is this. We used to have it where you had to check this checkbox that if you forgot it, it was a big problem. And so like, there's no checking any boxes here. This is always assumed. So like you would never create, a full pound out of here as your first package, because then that whole thing has to go to the lab. So this would be like whatever your lab sample is, goes in both spots. And then we would save that package. Of course, you have to have a product that has the same strain as the strain you're harvesting. So if you had a product with that old new strain, and then you put in the new strain, the product wouldn't show up here because that's a different database entry. So from the computer's end, it's not the same strain. And then users required. And after that, we send that sample package. We'll do that in a second here. But we send that sample package to the lab, and then that sample package gets tested. And then we'll see like a failed or a passed come up here, which means then we see this, where we can create anything that we want. Or if it's failed, we just can't do anything. So like this one is failed, which means it's had a lab sample sent off that's failed. Oops, sorry. So our failed lab result package here. Well, maybe it's been updated, but like there'll be a bar up here that will prevent us from actually making packages saying we have a failed test result. Now, sending to the lab is through the supply chain. So inventory, the product page goes alphabetical, but the inventory page goes by last created, will show up at the top. So like you can always come here and grab package ID for things. If you've got multiple package IDs, this will be the most recent stuff that's been added to the inventory page. And then we're on to supply chain. And then we're doing a sales order. Really anything going out of the system is a sales order. And then we create sales order and need to make sure that we go to lab partner. And the main thing you can see here is that if you ever have to select this, that means you're not on the lab, because the lab only takes medicated stuff. Whereas if you're on a regular sales partner, you can send non-medicated technically. And so you'll know your lab, we'll have dates, and then you'll add the items onto the sales order, complete the transfer where you'll select the package, and then it'll go off to the lab. And then the lab will receive it. And we might have a couple labs on here, I'm not sure, but basically the lab supply chain mapping is, at least right now as of today and the rest of this week, much easier than the operator's supply chain mapping, because the lab doesn't actually have to go create a purchase order. They can just hit auto generate purchase order, and they can auto map, which means they can have the system automatically create a product for this item, and the product is created in the taxonomized name of category, subcategory, unit of measure. So like this is in flower or buds, and then it's GR, for instance. And that's the product name that would come up here. So you can see some lab created products. Now, even if we don't have any labs on here, this is relevant to go over, just because this is how the lab receives stuff. And then once the lab places test results on an item, then if I QA too quickly, I see the batch still locked up. So it's going to take like a minute, 2 minutes solid for the information to propagate from the lab for the package on, or for the batch on the operator side to inherit that test result. But it is like a minute or 2 minutes. And then you can make other packages. And that pretty much wraps up our grow, as well as some testing workflows. Now,
we have a few questions on the grow side, Seth, before you move on, if you're ready for them.
Okay.
The first one we have is, will we ever be able to edit a strain name after entering an org strains? Maybe some compliance considerations there as well. But
yeah, well, we could scope a lift on it. The problem is, once it's like the cost thing, it's on different tables. So like we create a strain, and then that strain goes into plants, then a batch, then on a a product master, and then we'd have to make sure that if you update the strain name, it updates all the tables to which that strain name has been transferred to through the workflow. But that's certainly a feature request, Robin, we could put in.
Okay.
Check on. Yeah, so that's good.
And this next one sounds like a feature request as well, but want to bring it to your attention. In E&I, when searching, the search remains in the search bar while tabbing through pre-run, curing, etc. Is that possible on the plants page?
Oh, right, because you have to search each page to maybe see where a plant is. That'd be an interesting one to vote on, which we don't have the capability of doing, so I should have said it. But yeah, good feature request. Yeah. Okay, I get it.
All right. And then the last one that we had is a pretty complex question. So I'm going to put it to you and let me know if you need more information. We can ask for more. When changing the strain, the P.00 designation is not smart anymore. In the past, if I changed from CHD to DLM, the P would become a PA. Now, after changing the strain, I could have two plants with the same exact ID. I guess the question is that a known issue, or is there any known workarounds or workflow changes there? Or do we need more information?
Well, we should probably put in a ticket for that. What I will say is that we did make a change to where, in fact, Miles and I talked about this one because it was a change that stopped some downstream errors in the system, but also limited some immediate like editability of things. Because like, so here you can see these messages now, where if anything changes here, it changes for all the strains. So like if you put in 100 plants and you had to change the strain on 50 of them, you can't do that anymore, because then that changes or doesn't change the batch name, or and so we'll have to look at I'll talk. Well, I mean, we can put that ticket in, because if we can get that detailed ticket in, then I could talk to Joseph about it, one of our Step 3 engineers who found these downstream issues when when we allowed like partial strain or partial plants of a batch to have things changed, and then logic wise later it's like you have a batch is one strain of at one time, so we can research that one.
And that's it for the questions that we have right now.
Okay, sweet. So the lab reception, that functionality has now been put in here for the retail operators, or all the operators, not just the retail. Retail's received tons of stuff, but so do EIs from the grow. And so we're going to go right to a retail here. I sent some stuff. It's obviously not a real world representation because we have a lab and a reg council and everything on here, but we sent some stuff from the EI this morning to the retail. And we'll toggle this on Monday like we always do from webinars. And then I think Miles or Robin or somebody's putting in a link to the chat here. And this is a link of the knowledge base. We've had plenty of time to get this ready, as Robin has worked with the state to get approval for us to release this. And that's given, Miles and I time to check the knowledge base. So like check that link, and if you want to read along with us, but in the end, it's super fast. So for instance, you'll go into here, you'll go to supply chain. Notice I didn't go to purchase order first. Now, of course, if you make the purchase order, like when you're actually making the order, which some people do, some people don't, as far as the system goes, you certainly don't have to have a purchase order, ahead of time before you make a request for something, right? So sometimes the workflow is a sales order comes in, you already know what that is, it's coming in, and then you create the purchase order and then do the supply chain mapping. Obviously, you might create the purchase order days in advance in the system, so you have it there. If that's not the case, we have purchase order auto create for operators now. So this one, I always do the date search. Field unfreezes. There's no purchase order here, even though there's a crap load of purchase orders from our sample, but like I haven't created one for this. So, but you can still map to a purchase order that you've created separately ahead of time, 5 minutes ahead or 3 days ahead. But like you can also now auto create purchase order. This will auto create the purchase order. You'll never even actually see the purchase order unless you go back to the supply chain screen. We'll look at that, or rather the supply chain area. But it also has, now this will not auto create products like I mentioned for the lab, where it's a taxonomy of category, subcategory, unit of measure, since that would be a mess if everybody just only had those on their labels. We don't have any idea what they're buying. But here you can see one of these is filled into the product automatically, even though there's a ton of other options, and the other one is not filled in. It's because I have already brought in this strain and I have not yet brought over this strain. So after I map this to the 13 dogs, or if I have to create it and then make it, fine. But after I've brought in something one time, then it will remember this. So there's a memory, and the next time these will just show up in here. And if it's brought into the wrong item, I can still change it, and we've made sure to make the logic always look at the most recently map thing versus like the first map thing. So any changes you make that you receive then will always be the last map thing, and will be what show up next time in the drop down memory wise. Now, once I hit go, it brings me right into the transfer, and I can just nail the inventory location and send it in. But I do have the purchase order here. So remember, we had the whole thing about the cost, and how before sometimes the costs were coming from the sales order versus the purchase order that you created. Well, this still gives you the ability to edit the cost of the purchase order. So you can really quickly create a purchase order this way. And then you can jump back in here to the supply chain purchase orders, and you'll see that our latest purchase order is today. This is the purchase order that just got created in the back end from that mapping page. And then, this is modifiable because we haven't brought anything in yet. And then we can bring it in from here. Or rather, you'd have to go to supply chain mapping and then, receive the transfer, map it to the purchase order. But you can, in some ways, create the purchase order that then you modify, create it really quickly, or just create it and skip right past it and go to the inventory receipt. And that's the new feature there. So that'll be available everywhere. So it'll be easier on transfers from Grow to EI because grower processor, because those share the same product list. So when the Grow makes a product, it's already existing for the read. Now that doesn't mean it'll automatically map to that. The system makes you map it the first time, but then after that, so you'll never probably have to create new products receiving at the EI unless you receive into a different item master altogether. But then it'll remember subsequent receptions. Well, thanks everybody.
Thank you all so much for attending today. We do have additional features. If you'd like to learn more, you can always talk to our friend Robin here. And as always, a version of this will be sent out following this along with that KB article. If you have anything else, please feel free to reach out. And with that, thank you all so much. Have a great weekend.